Welcome to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick, lifelong disaster enthusiast and someone who's never met a tragic historical event that I don't want to read 12 books about.
And I'm Arin Babbick, the guy who married the disaster enthusiast and knows way too much about industrial explosions and maritime mishaps.
Today, we're stepping into the big top for a story that's anything but fun and games. It's the tale of the Hartford Circus Fire of 1944, a day so devastating that it's been called the day the clowns cried.
It was a fire that turned what should have been a carefree afternoon of cotton candy and acrobats into one of the deadliest disasters in circus history.
We'll explore how the flames started, why so many lives were tragically lost, and how this catastrophe changed safety standards forever. And while we'll keep some of our usual humor, we promise, no clowning around when it comes to victims and their stories.
So grab your popcorn, but maybe keep a fire extinguisher handy, because this is one circus act you won't believe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back.
Welcome back. We're excited to be back.
Yeah, we're home from Florida, and it was amazing.
A great trip.
I did not post much about it when we were gone. I did post on the pages one of the cocktails we had.
Yeah, which one?
The Apollo.
Ooh.
I couldn't resist after doing all of the space disasters while we went to Universal Studios. So we were at the Galaxy bowling alley that was there, and they had all these space-themed drinks, and the Apollo was bomb.
It was really good.
We really failed not having that for every episode. It was incredible. The whole trip was great, though. We got to be warm. We got to swim. We got to ride lots of rides. Good time.
Wore the kids out thoroughly.
Yeah, they were vacationed out by day 3. It was pretty. They were done with this nonsense.
And there was still 4 more days.
And they were still getting up at 6 a.m. and doing full park days from open to close.
They kept telling us they didn't want to do a full park day, but then they didn't want to leave the park once we were there. So it was good. We had a great trip. I read a great book called The Unthinkable by, I forget what her name was, but it's a really good book if you guys haven't checked it out. It's about the psychology of disaster. Oh. And I read that at Volcano Bay. All right.
And in the car, but it was really good. So I really enjoyed that too. To keep it a little disaster themed because, it's where we are. So yeah, I hope everyone else had an equally good week. This week, we're going to be doing the Hartford Circus Fire, which is one I really enjoy. It's a really interesting one. It's another fire because, disaster podcast. We're doing lots of fire things. Mm-hmm. This one's a little different than the ones we've done before because it's part structure fire, part wildfire, which is pretty cool.
Interesting.
I think it's a good one. So yeah, with that, is there anything else? Oh, I wanted to say at the top of the episode, if you guys want to help us out, one of the number one things you can do is rate and review, particularly if you listen on Apple Podcasts, because I guess a lot of the different podcast groups they take from Apple Podcasts. So if you want to help us get our name out there, rate and review. We would love it and appreciate it.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So with that, are you ready to... Oh, we don't have drinks today.
No, because we have things we have to do. We have to drive.
Yeah, we're not recording at night tonight. We're recording during the day, and it's actually still morning, so it didn't seem appropriate. But if we were going to have a drink, I would have some fire whiskey.
Or something circus-themed?
What drink is circus-themed?
I'm sure there is one. Get ChatGPT for the win.
But instead, we have water.
Mm.
So are you ready?
Hydrate after our vacation.
We do need a lot of hydration. Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's swing into action. Let's do it.
Swing into action. There are acrobats in this, which is pretty cool.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
So the quote for this week is, "You see, 1 minute it's on fire. The next, there's no top. It's impossible to save a circus tent." And that is David Deacon Blanchfield, the Ringling Superintendent of Trucks and Tractors. And he was referring to another fire called the Menagerie Fire that we're going to talk about a little bit in this episode.
All right.
So yeah, circus fires, not good.
I would imagine not.
Not good at all. This disaster takes place in 1944. So can you think of any big world things going on in 1944?
World War II?
World War II. We're right in the middle of World War II. The country was in absolute turmoil, the United States, because this takes place in Hartford, Connecticut in the United States. So the United States and really the whole world was in complete turmoil at this point. And the whole bread and circuses thing was alive and well. So it was, I wouldn't call it necessarily the full heyday of circuses, but circuses were very, very, very popular. It was a big deal when the circus came to town. People got really excited about it because it's something to get your mind off of it.
Yeah, it's a distraction.
Something new, something different, pretty cool thing. This is still the era where it's called, the greatest show on earth. You've got Barnum and Bailey, you've got the Ringling Brothers, all those different things. This is the
greatest show.
Yeah, it is. This is the time they still had menageries in the circus with like elephants and camels and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. And some of them would perform in the circus, and then some of them would just kind of be in tents where you could just go through and look at them, hang out like a zoo, right? They also had high-rise acts walking tight ropes far above the crowd, which were not as safe as they are today. They didn't have as many safety regulations. So you really were, they knew what they were doing. And deaths from that kind of stuff were few and far between. But it was still a real risk to be doing these high rope and acrobatics and all that kind of stuff.
I think that was part of the draw, though, too.
It's what I'm getting to, that is part of the draw of the circus, is not only do you get to see these cool feats, you might see someone fall. And that's, for better or worse, humanity has always been morbidly curious about these things. And that was part of the draw of the circus.
Well, this is one of those lines, death-defying feats.
Exactly. Yep. And there were also clowns. This is kind of the heyday of all of the clowns. We go to a local circus every year at the State Fair of Virginia.
Yeah.
And we love that. And they do still have some clowns in some of the other circuses I've been to, but they've really toned down the clowning, which I think has a lot to do with like popular media making clowns more scary.
Maybe.
But this was not like that in 1944. Clowns were still a huge part of the circus act all the way through and very, very, very popular, which scares me a little bit more than the fire, to be honest.
Are you scared of clowns?
I don't know if I'm scared of clowns. I don't like them. It's very uncanny valley to me when I see like a full paint clown. And then it got worse for me when I realized that, and not kink shaming, but there's an entire fetish community of clowns. And you know me, I go on these weird deep dives.
Yeah.
I have had a friend who I didn't realize was into that until her regular Facebook page turned into like an OnlyFans for clowns.
Okay.
And it took me a hot minute to figure out like who... And get your bag, go for it. Like no kink shaming at all. But now that I know that that's a thing, it's hard for me to see clowns in the circus and not think about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So my background, I doing the professional magic when I was much, much younger. I was friends with a lot of clowns.
No, you were not.
Seriously.
Are you joking?
Like legit clowns. They were really good too. They did, children's parties, big events, things like that. I learned how to make animal balloons from...
See, this is the other thing about clowns that like really kind of stresses me out, is that they show up when you least expect it. Like, you just suddenly realize a fucking clown. Like, my parents, my dad, their business, one of the ladies who worked there as a secretary was like a clown on the side. Yeah. And I didn't know it for years. And then one day they were like, oh, do you want her to come do like a birthday party for your kid? And I would have been fine with it. It didn't end up working out, but it was just like, she's also a clown, like on the side. People just clown on the side.
Yeah.
That is just an odd...
I mean, it's not usually a main gig.
I guess not. Look, do what you do. Get your bag. Enjoy it. It just surprises me constantly how many clowns, I guess not constantly, but whenever clowns come up, I'm like, they're everywhere. Everywhere. And they're just normal people living their life, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
And they're wonderful. And like the people I know who are clowns, like the gal on Facebook and the secretary, they are the coolest people. Like, I fucking love them. They're amazing. And if you're listening to this, I'm not making fun of you, I swear. It just surprised me. So when I say I don't like clowns, I don't know. Anyways, circus fires.
The circus fires.
That was a big tangent onto clowns. Circus fires. So circus fires are not that uncommon.
I imagine they
or at least
be.
They weren't in 1944. They weren't like happening all the time. The circus wasn't burning down constantly. But it was, one of those, this is a thing that happens from time to time. Mm-hmm. The circus just, fucking burns down because that's fine. This is normal. In 1799, Ricketts Equestrian Circus, which was the first circus in America, lost their Philadelphia amphitheater when it burned to the ground.
Okay.
We all have probably heard of P.T. Barnum and seen it in The Greatest Showman, the first fire that hit up P.T. Barnum. Yep. That was in July of 1865 when his American Museum at Broadway and Ann Street burned down. The firemen tried to smash open the whale tank during that fire to use the water from it.
He had a whale tank?
He had a whale tank.
So I didn't see that in the movie.
They because you're going to find out why. They smashed open the whale tank, and the water from the whale tank didn't put out the fire, and the whales ended up burning to death. They died before they could die of suffocation. They burned to death after they smashed it open and ended up on the ground. So pretty awful.
Wow.
How
did he get a whale? Or whales, multiple whales?
P.T. Barnum do anything he did. P.T. Barnum was just the coolest. That's all I can say.
I don't know about the coolest. He, from all accounts, is kind of...
Okay, I mean, there is that. But
not great, too.
I would have visited the shit out of anything P.T. Barnum. I probably would have been mad about it, but I would have gone.
Fair enough.
It
was a spectacle.
Yeah, it was. In 1868, his next museum also burned down.
Not a good track record.
In 1887, Barnum in London and Bridgeport, Connecticut burned to the ground, killing most of the circus animals. Barnum really had a lot of fires. And in 1900, there was yet another major blaze for P.T. Barnum's circus. So
I feel like
the big one.
I feel like this is the Monty Python scene where the guy's talking about his castle falling down in the swamp.
It feels like it.
Burning down.
I mean,
P.T. Barnum still keeps building it.
But he wasn't alive through all of these. He was alive through several of them, but he eventually died before. And his shit kept burning. So, sorry, buddy. There were several minor fires almost yearly through the 19-teens.
Okay.
And then it kind of slowed down for a bit in the 1920s and 30s, thankfully. There was some new regulations on how to waterproof the big top and all these other things. There was slightly less fires, with one kind of major exception in 1924, where there was one big circus fire again for P.T. Barnum's circus that ended up costing...
P.T. Barnum.
And it ended up causing $100,000 in losses, which in 1924 is a shit ton of losses. Yeah. So Ringling Brothers, which is by the time we get to where we're at now, the circus that we're going to be talking about is the Ringling Brothers Circus, right? So that's the circus. They had reputation of being the lucky circus.
Okay.
Because they didn't burn down a lot.
All right.
They didn't have a lot of deaths. They didn't have a lot of terrible things happen. And one of the running things they put out there is it's because they were what's called a Sunday school circus. They didn't do the crazy spectacle the way Barnum did. There was still spectacle, but it was more toned down. There wasn't any cursing. There wasn't any super scary acts. It was intended to be very child friendly and not just shock you. And they were yeah, because we're the Sunday circus.
Okay.
We don't burn down, I guess. That was the running thing from them. But, and they also didn't have any gambling. They didn't have the carny things.
The games, the rigged games.
And most other circuses, even now, have all of those games that are essentially gambling.
The
house always wins. Ringling Brothers didn't have that. So that was another part of why they were considered a Sunday school show. But they did have some fires. They were luckier, but they still had some. Their first one was in 1901 in Kansas City, Missouri, which thankfully no one was hurt, but the big top did burn down. In 1912, another big top burned for Ringling Brothers that actually had 15,000 people inside. But
good God, 15,000 people
15,000 in the big top.
That's incredible.
But it was found quickly, and everyone was able to be evacuated, so no one got hurt in that fire, which is pretty amazing. And again, lucky.
Yeah.
Right? In May of 1914, they did have a big fire on their railway cars.
All right.
There's a whole series of stuff that happened with that. But basically, the long and short of it is there was 43 railway cars for their circus that burned to a crisp. And several people died. So not great there. They did see the 1920s and 1930s. While they didn't see as many fires as those preceding years, they actually did see a lot of train wrecks. And that one was kind of the beginning of the train wrecks.
Okay.
In 1914. The most famous of these train wrecks was in 1918 in June. At 4 a.m., the crew of the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus stopped in Indiana to fix some things. Most of the train was off the main track, except for 4 of the sleeper cars where the circus folks slept when they were on the road.
Oh, good.
A train driver fell asleep at the wheel and blew through the stop and crashed into the 4 sleeper cars. This was bad enough, but it was compounded by the fact that they had kerosene lamps. in them.
Oh, awesome.
So when the rescuers, like all the rest of the circus, tried to climb in to save everyone who was in these like mangled train cars, it caught on fire and they kind of had to retreat, and a lot of people ended up burning to death. It killed 85 people, which is kind of a vague number, roughly. Probably a better estimate there, because many of them were so burned beyond recognition or burned together or were missing without a trace. This is the best kind of estimate. It was so bad that bodies and pieces of bodies were being carried out in water buckets once they got the fire out.
Oh, God.
Yep. The circus it wasn't the safest thing.
No.
But up until this fire, no one had been really hurt at the circus who wasn't a circus performer. So for the general public looking at it, it's scary and dangerous to work at the circus, but it's perfectly fine to go visit it as a spectator. Which, take that for what it's worth. That was a lot of the mindset going on at this point. Now, this brings us up to the 1940s. In 1942, there was one big fire that we do need to mention because it was Ringling Brothers. This was in Cleveland, and this was called the Menagerie Fire.
Okay.
So you can imagine which part. Yeah. Which part burned down.
The animals again.
Now, for this, they do shows over the course of several days. During the first show of the run they were doing in Cleveland, one of the lions mauled a trainer. During the show. So,
you came to see a show and you got a show.
Yep. And it's not starting lucky. And circus people are very superstitious. And one of the big superstitions is being late to or missing the matinee is very bad luck. So they almost missed the matinee. They were late. They did do it. And then a lion mauled a trainer at the matinee. So they were already not feeling great about their luck at this point because, very superstitious, right?
Okay.
Now, on August 4th, 1942, when the circus folks were at lunch and the animals were either grazing or in their cages in the tent, someone ran screaming in where all the circus workers were having lunch, saying that there was a menagerie fire around 11:30 that day.
All right.
It all happened super fast. It started real small, but it overtook the entire menagerie tent within minutes, just going up in flames.
It's because all the straw they were using for bedding? Or...
So we're going to go into it a little bit more. But by the time World War II rolls around, with rationing going on, the majority of circuses waterproofed their tents using a combination of paraffin and gasoline. And they would just rub that all over the top of the big top.
Yeah,
so,
that's...
Number one, canvas is flammable on its own.
Yeah.
It just is. And it's going to be on dry land for the most part because the circus doesn't travel as much in the winter. And it's also extraordinarily flammable because it's literally coated in paraffin and gasoline.
Yep.
So it makes the circus tents really like a giant wick of a candle. And everything just whoosh right up. And that's what happened here. Whoosh, right up. Well, they were all at lunch, so there weren't many people at the menagerie tent to be able to spot it when it was really small.
Yeah.
Instead, they're all running over as it's really overtaken the whole thing, and there's no saving the tent at this point. You just might have a chance to save some of the animals. The circus folk dove into the tent to try and save them. One of the giraffes actually managed to leap up over its fencing and run off into town. Other animals were just straight up trapped. There was flaming bits of canvas dropping down on the hay and straw in the cages and enclosures and started going up quickly along with the tent going up. A zebra ended up making it out the front entrance, running like mad. An ostrich made it out too. So you can just imagine.
It's chaos.
It's chaos and not regular panic chaos. Exotic animals running everywhere. Many of the animals, though, were too scared to move. None of the camels would leave. Like, they actually made it to the camels and tried to get them out, and all the camels just laid down and stuck their heads in the sand and refused to leave. Most of the elephants refused to leave. They managed to get a few of them out, but a lot of them were just too scared to move because you got to remember, everything's on fire. It's dropping from the ceiling. It's on the walls, and these are wild animals. This is...
Yeah.
Sometimes you just panic and you freeze. So it was not good. Much of the menagerie ended up either dying in the fire or had to be put down by the local police.
Oh, wow.
By the time all was said and done. And to make it even worse, it took them a bit to figure out how to put these large animals down because the revolvers that the police typically carried were not strong enough weapons to put down, say, an elephant. They had to bring in larger weaponry. So a number of the animals were shot and then had to be shot again to be able to put down.
God.
Yeah, it was pretty awful. Sorry.
Sorry, that didn't kill you. Hold on a second. I need to get a bigger gun.
Pause. Wait. The final death toll was 4 elephants, all 13 camels, all 9 zebras, 5 lions, 2 tigers, 2 giraffes, 2 gnus, 2 white fallow deer, 2 Celion donkeys, 1 axis deer, 1 puma, 1 chimpanzee, and 1 ostrich.
The lions survived?
Yeah, most of the lions survived. 5 of them died, but a few of the lions survived.
I missed the lions one.
Yeah, there was 5 lions that died. Okay. So most of the menagerie was gone at this point. They did manage to save a number of animals, but this wiped out Ringling Brothers Menagerie. Ringling, after this was done, being ever the most compassionate corporation known to man, put out to the public that they had no insurance on the menagerie and solicited public donations to help them rebuild it and keep going, while privately collecting $36,000 from their insurance company for the loss of the menagerie.
Some bitches.
After the menagerie fire, they canceled the matinee the next day, but did play the evening show.
Oh, wow.
So everything burned down.
Kept going.
They're still putting down animals, and they're still going. The show must go on. A few days later, a man named Lamondris Ford was arrested while riding a freight train for riding it without permission and confessed to setting the fire to get even with the circus for firing him and his friend Jess Johnson that Tuesday morning.
Oh, my God.
So it was most likely arson.
Wow.
The investigation uncovered that Ford had suffered a major head injury in a car wreck the year before and that he likely was not mentally fit. So his confession was eventually called a hoax, maybe, and he was institutionalized at a facility for the, quote, feeble-minded. And the cause of the fire remains officially unknown. But a lot of people who I read about it think that, he may have been hit in the head, yes, and he may have been, mentally unfit, but he also probably started the fire. Because he definitely was fired that Tuesday, and he was spotted near the tent. So, not for sure, but that's where we are. So, between this and everything else going on, the perception of circuses being this dangerous and slapdash workplace was very prevalent. We just talked about a little bit ago. It felt very dangerous to work at the circus, but no people died in the menagerie fire, and absolutely no spectators died. Even in the fire that, blew up 15,000 people, Big Top, no spectators died.
Right.
So people considered the circus itself, the people who worked there, to be in danger, but not themselves.
Uh-huh.
And that's the kind of mentality. And in a lot of ways, I think that's a mentality we still have today when it comes to the circus. Well, no, just when it comes to the circus. You look at, it's not always circuses now. It's also the carnivals come around with all the rides and stuff.
That's what I was thinking of, the rides that are hastily assembled. Mm-hmm. And then they're really rickety and they break them down and travel.
But we all still go.
Oh, yeah. We still ride those things.
And we all kind of worry more about the carnies than we do about the circus, which is a bit ridiculous and a bit dumb because the people who work there are wonderful people.
Uh-huh.
But there's still very much this perception of circus folk and carnival folk of being slapdash, of not having it all together, of slapdash putting together those rides, of not having it all put together and, safe and all this kind of stuff. And this is really where a lot of that
comes from,
that stereotype. And, take it for what it's worth. It is what it is. Now, that same year, that Thanksgiving of 1942, saw the Coconut Grove fire, which is a fire we will cover eventually. This was a huge nightclub fire. We mentioned it in our Station Club episode. But this was a nightclub in Boston that caught fire and burned to the ground in 7 minutes, killing 492 people.
Damn.
Big deal. Most people in this fire, as in most structure fires, died from asphyxiation. All 492 people were able to be positively identified, but the tragedy between that and the menagerie fire really underscored that this is not a great thing. It happens. We should probably do more about it, but also things just burned down. Very odd dynamic of thoughts going on. Now, and Coconut Grove, they never found out what caused that fire either. Shit's just burning down everywhere in the 1940s. No one knows why officially. Coconut Grove also led to a rash of strict enforcement, more fire codes, changes to the way we deal with things, particularly when it comes to structures.
Yeah.
That a lot of places on the East Coast, particularly in New England, were really taking on board and making changes for. But most of them applied to structures, buildings.
Yeah.
They didn't apply to the circus because the circus is a movable building. It's not a permanent structure.
Yeah.
So there's a heightened sense of shit fires happen, a heightened sense of we need to do more to keep people safe. But it didn't extend to the circus the way it probably should have. I mean, hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
But it's the same year we have the Menagerie Fire in Coconut Grove. So it's interesting that you don't see more regulations on the circus, but you do at Coconut Grove, which probably has to do with the fact that one killed almost 500 people.
Yeah.
And one didn't. But, it's interesting. So let's skip forward a couple of years to 1944.
All right.
2 days before the disaster was July 4th, 1944.
Okay.
Every year, a lot of circuses celebrate Christmas in July, on July 4th.
Oh, really?
Because they're usually busy on actual Christmas. So it's one of the few times that the public and circus folk get together and hang out. They'll do like a giant barbecue for everyone who can come hang out and do. So there's a really neat tradition where the community gets to kind of hang out, or it was a neat tradition where the community gets to hang out and do all kinds of things together. And I thought that was pretty neat. All around Hartford, Connecticut, businesses had banners announcing the circus coming. The circus Ringling Brothers in particular, would give business owners free tickets to the circus if they put up flyers in their building.
Uh-huh.
So just put up this poster and you can come with your kids for free. So they're everywhere. They are very, very well advertised.
That's clever.
Yeah. They were in Providence at this point on July 5th. They headed out to Hartford, Connecticut, where all of those posters are already up, leaving their Christmas in July, and absolutely blew the first matinee in Hartford, Connecticut.
Oh, no.
Did not make it to the matinee.
Oh, no.
It's not good. Whatever the reason for why they blew it, it could be something that the circus blamed it on the trains not being on time. The trains said, look, you changed your ownership and everything is going kind of bonkers bananas. No one seems to know what they're doing because they had just recently changed from one of the Ringling Brother kids to another one of the kids, and everything was just kind of in flux at this point.
Okay.
Doesn't really matter. The fact is they blew the matinee, and the circus people were nervous as hell about it because this is not a good thing according to their superstitions.
Right. I mean, the last time they had a lion maul someone and caught on fire. The
reality is there's a really good chance that it also had to do with the fact that circus manpower was at an all-time low.
Okay.
Pretty much anyone, any young man of any kind of strength was fighting in the war. They weren't working at the circus at this point.
Yeah.
They normally had something like 900 people, and they only had 600 at this point. So they were down quite a bit in manpower. And most of the people who were working there were not necessarily the best of the best, because these are the people who couldn't go to war. So it wasn't a great time for the circus in that regard. Now, the circus had performed in Hartford, Connecticut many, many times before. So they knew what they were doing. In general, the circus works a lot like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knows their part to play. They know how to tear down. They know how to set up. They know how to do it quickly because you kind of have to when you only stay somewhere for 3 or 4 days. So before they even got there to Hartford, Connecticut, before they even blew the matinee, they had people there preparing the field. And for this location in Hartford, they performed at Barber Street Grounds.
Okay.
Which is just this big open field at the time. And it was enough space to be able to set up the big top, the thoroughfare where like all the vendors go.
Yeah.
They couldn't set up the full menagerie tent, but they were able to set up like a little maze of menagerie cages, essentially, to be able to walk through. But they were very, very good at it. They hadn't performed there in a few years preceding because there had been a big strike in 1938.
Okay.
And there had been some like figuring things out, but they'd been performing there over and over and over again for years. So like even with that brief break, this was well-known ground.
Okay.
And they were very good at setting that all up. So they had folks there mowing, tamping down the grass, getting the big top set up, getting the water trucks in position, setting up the midway, just all the things. They actually used the elephants to set up the big top, which I thought was pretty interesting at the time.
Yeah, I remember seeing something about that, or like it was in some show or cartoon or something.
But that's the thing they did. So a lot of kids would gather once the circus trucks started showing up. To watch as they were setting all that up, and considered it kind of a free show. So they had people there before the main circus got there. Then they had some of the animals getting there, and it kind of goes in pieces as it gets set up over the course of a day. But that's what happened. Around 11 o'clock on July 5th, Charles Hayes arrived on scene to inspect what was going on. He was the town's local inspector.
Okay.
There was no law that required him to inspect the circus the way he inspected buildings for fire codes, but it was kind of a tradition, and he did it anyway. So he was there. He inspected. He left before they finished setting everything up because they were so late. Came back a few hours later, but it all looked the same as it always had.
Yeah.
It looked fine. They had a new big top this year. Ooh. According to the circus, it was the largest tent in the world, which maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But they billeted it as the largest tent in the world, and it definitely was bigger than anything they had had before. They had gotten it that May. It was made by sailmakers who made sail ship riggings, I guess.
That would make sense.
And
I was kind of wondering where they got all these giant tents.
Yeah, they built it out of the same canvas that sail ships' sails are made out of. Before they got it, it had been waterproofed with 6,000 gallons white gasoline and 18,000 pounds of paraffin. They would melt the paraffin in cauldrons and then thin it out with gasoline and rub it onto the canvas with brooms. So the entire thing is covered with that much gasoline, that much paraffin, just sticky into it and ready to burn, apparently. Inside the tent, there were bleachers all the way around, and then underneath the bleachers at the bottom around where the ring was, there were chairs. The chairs looked lightweight when you look at them in pictures. They don't look like they're that heavy, but they're actually pretty hefty. They weighed around 10 pounds each.
Oh, wow.
And every single year, when the colors for the circus changed, they'd re-dip them in paint. So they got dipped in a new color of paint every single year, and they never, stripped it. And all of this paint was also extremely flammable. So,
my God.
Layers and layers and layers of flammable paint on very heavy chairs surrounding the bottom of the ring. Around the tent, sidewall was being fastened into the ground. So they have the panels all the way around, and then you've got the top part. Now, the panels around the ground, they can be rolled up to allow more airflow. But most circuses, Ringling Brothers included, near the entrance and the exit would nail down the sidewall pretty heavily to prevent people from sneaking in once the show started. So it was far more secure in the areas that people knew to enter and exit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that sound familiar at all from our station nightclub fire? Why this might not be a great thing?
Well, it restricts
egress.
Escape.
It's very hard to get out. But the rest of the sidewall was going to be rolled up or rolled down, depending on what part of the tent was, to allow airflow. It's just those one section, or those couple of sections that were nailed down more heavily, which that's good. It's for something. Tickets were on sale now, July 5th, $1.20 for the grandstands, or $2.20 for the best seats in the house.
Oh, big spender.
Right. There is a bond campaign still on. If you bought a $100 bond from the United States government, you got tickets to the best seats in the house.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty. It's a lot of circuses and a lot of shows did that during World War II.
Interesting.
As, their patriotic duty to get people to buy more bonds. Pretty cool. So the evening show on July 5th went on as scheduled, but it ended up having a much larger crowd than expected because many folks who missed the matinee went to the evening show instead.
Makes sense.
There were some cops stationed at the area, but no firefighters. There were regulations that stated one or the other needed to be there. You didn't need both. So you either needed to have some cops or you needed to have some firefighters. Many of the cops, for being willing to stand duty, got free tickets to the show as well for them and their families. So there's a lot of police officers attending the show. And a number of police officers just hanging out, making sure that no nonsense happens in the area.
Right.
It was incredibly hot. Most folks were wearing summery clothes, sundresses, shorts, lightweight to help with the stagnant heat, especially in the big top. Tomorrow would promise more of the same. The big cat opener was how the show started, where the trainers had these big cats all up on huge arches, and they did little pirouettes and shit.
Oh, cool.
Which just sounds neat to me, though obviously pretty awful for the cats.
Probably.
And then they had aerialists that rode bicycles high above the crowd. There were elephants that carried ballet girls around, just a fun circus. Everyone was really excited for it. They enjoyed that evening show, and people who didn't make it to that were looking forward to the next day. So, it's July 6th, 1944, a month after D-Day. But even with the war winding down, many people still had to work for the war effort, particularly men. So the circus crowd for that day's matinee was primarily women with young children, grandparents, or folks that didn't have to be at work. There was certainly a number of men, but not the normal numbers you would see at a show like this. The day was going to be an absolute scorcher. So all of those sundresses and shorts and stuff that we talked about were going to be in even more effect here because it's not nighttime. It was already 76 in Connecticut by 8 a.m. that morning with absolutely horrific humidity, and it was only going to get warmer by the time matinee rolled around. On the midway, trucks went up and down, sprinkling the grass with water to keep the dust down. This was going to be their last day at Hartford, and then they were going to tear down tonight and set off tomorrow. In Hartford and surrounding towns, kids and families piled into cars or got on buses to head down to the circus, dressed for the weather again. Whatever they could do to make the heat more bearable. Raymond Erickson was going with his aunt and her family. His shoelace broke, and before he left, his mother tied it into a knot and hid it in his shoe so it wouldn't show. His mom wasn't going. She was going to be staying home with his sister Joanne, who was sick.
Okay.
The Cook family went as well. Mother Mildred Cook and her 3 children, Eleanor, Donald, and Edward. By 10 o'clock, the heat was well into the 80s, and quite a few people made the choice to see a movie instead in the AC and were grateful for it later. But many who did decide to go and catch the show while they could. In East Hartford, 10-year-old Donald Gale's mother's friend, Hulda Grant, asked him if he wanted to come down to the circus with her and her daughter. His parents gave him permission to go, and he was absolutely psyched. By 12 o'clock, Hartford Hospital already had a case of heat prostration, which is essentially heat stroke. That's what they called it in the 1940s. And at the midway, the water truck was supposed to sprinkle the midway one more time, but skipped it because they were running late. They also did not pull up next to the circus tent like they were supposed to.
Ooh.
Did I say what the water trucks were?
I have a picture, but...
So they literally had, like, sometimes zebra-drawn horse trucks that had water on them. And they were partially to keep the dust down, because these are all on big fields, and they mowed them really flat in hot weather. You just sprinkle it with just enough water to keep the dust from kicking up when people step on it, but not enough to make it muddy.
Yeah.
And then they also were supposed to get stationed next to the big top to be able to put out any fires that pop up there.
Before it gets out of control.
Yeah, and they also would give out water to people and whatnot too, but they had like lots of different purposes and lots of different places to be. So while it is really shitty that the water truck didn't make it to the big top, it's also not that crazy unusual for it to not happen, especially because it wasn't something that was like legally required of them. It's just something the circus did in general.
Yeah.
Which I mean, sense. You should remember that, but I feel like I made it sound like a lot worse than it is there. So, yeah. Doors would open at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, folks who were early could grab Cokes, hot dogs, pink lemonade, other circus fair food at the midway, check out the menagerie animals that weren't in the menagerie tent like usual. We're just kind of spread around the side of the circus, but generally, it's a fair.
Yeah.
Hang out at the fair for the day. So it's hopping there. Maybelle Epps and her sister Maurice Goff took Maybelle's kids, William, who was 7, and Richard, who was 3, to the circus. Maybelle was also 7 months pregnant. Maurice's daughter Muriel went as well. All of the children's first visit to the circus. I should probably trigger warning that this one involves children dying. I should have done that at the top.
It's already pretty well apparent.
Anyway, so trigger warning. Kids die. Sorry, my bad. The heat inside the big top was worse than outside at 2 o'clock when the show was supposed to start. Partially because it was so crowded, and also just because it's inside. Even with those sidewalls open, it was stifling. The entrance of the tent was at one side and then all the way around are the grandstands, except for at the back where the performance entrance was and where the stage was for the band and various people coming out. On either side of that performance stage, there were 2 more exits that were called chutes that went directly into the ring in the middle, and that's where the animals came in and out of the big top. So they weren't officially exits, but they were openings that had like those cattle chutes type thing, like the big, I think they were like about the size of, a grown man that various animals can go through. And they weren't covered, but they were bars and they had a roof on them.
Okay.
All told, there was 9 exits in the big top, but only those few that I just mentioned were actually labeled and easy to find. So there were a few other official exits besides the performance exit and the entry, but those are not super helpful. At the end, farthest from the door, Merle Evans and his 29-piece band waited for the show to start. They would provide the music for everyone in the circus. Most estimates of that day put the crowd in the big top at around 6,700 people.
Jesus Christ.
In that one tent. It's a big tent.
I knew they were big. but like...
And it wasn't all the way full.
Man, I remember going to a pop-up circus like that when I think it was Ringling Brothers, when I was young, traveling circus, and they had a big top, but it was not nearly that large.
They're not anymore. And that we'll talk about that a bit at the end of this episode and the why.
It's crazy to me you have a tent that large. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's huge. And it, like I said, it was only about half full. They could have fit almost double that amount of people. Now, where it was full, it was very full. The grandstands that had people on them were packed tight because those were the parts that had the airflow. But there were full grandstands that didn't have, more than a couple of people in them, or chairs along the line that didn't have people in them.
Yeah.
There were some estimates that put the number at as low as 4,000.
Okay.
And some numbers that put it as high as 10,000. But I think from everything I read that probably 6,000 to 7,000 number is about where it was. And the capacity of the tent was kind of up for debate too. The circus put the capacity of their tent at 12,000 to 14,000, depending on who you asked.
Right.
And other estimates say the tent could probably hold 10,000 to 12,000. So just gives us kind of an idea of where it is. And a lot of that, back and forth on it isn't just about how big the tent is. It's about how much can you justify squishing people? How far can you put the chairs into these aisles? And the circus definitely tried to maximize it.
Of course.
On this particular day, though, it was not full.
Got it.
It wasn't empty, but it wasn't full.
6,000 is a lot of people.
6,000 to 7,000. Like 6,700 is what I read most places, but it does vary, so at 6,000 to 7,000.
Yeah, okay.
The first act was going to be the big cats and animal trainers, the lions and tigers and panthers and pumas.
What about the bears?
No, big cats first. Only big cats first.
So I was going for the lions, tigers, and bears.
Right?
I guess.
The main trainer would put lions up on these big metal arches first, and they're literally, exactly what I'm saying, big arches, and the lions would climb up on top of the arches and roar or growl or whatever from the top of them. And after that, May Kovar with her jaguars would bring them in and have them do tricks. And she only had this tiny little wand to control them with.
That's crazy.
And she was, and you see pictures of her, she's not a big lady.
Okay.
She has a presence to her, but she's not a big lady. But she would control them with her tiny wand for the most part, except for that one time earlier that year when she'd been badly mauled by one of those same jaguars.
Oh, wait. So she was the one who got mauled?
No, different one. The first mauling I talked about was a lion mauling a trainer. This is May Kovar, and the jaguars mauled her earlier that year.
But she survived.
She survived, and she actually performed the next day after being mauled in a sling. May Kovar is amazing. Such a badass.
That's ridiculous.
She continued to perform with her tiny wand.
I always assume when you say they were mauled by one of the big cats, I figure they're dead.
Nope, not dead and still performing.
That's
like
crazy.
A badass. Like a boss. They go through their stunts, they go through their madness, and then it's time for the aerial act after the big cats.
Okay.
And the aerial act at this show was going to start with bicycles riding across the top of the tent on big high wires. So classic circus stuff. At the end of the big cat show part of it, the music starts to play, the spotlights go up on the roof, and while the aerial act is going on, that's as the cats start going out at that point. So they don't all leave before that starts. The cats are still in the ring while the aerial act is going on up there. The well-orchestrated waltz is going on at this point. You have awesome, crazy music playing. You have bicycles riding high wires from the top.
Yeah.
You have May Kovar and the other animal trader sending their cats through one at a time through the chutes, because you can't send them more than one at a time because sometimes they get into fights.
Yeah.
And that can be a big problem. And it's really this big ballet almost of making sure all of these different pieces are going together.
I imagine you don't want the handlers that are backstage to have to deal with more than one cat at a time.
Yeah, very much. And at a show like this, and it's something we talked about at the station nightclub fire, and it's just a reality a lot of times in these kinds of disasters, you fall into a pattern of behavior as a spectator. You're expecting to see spectacle. You're expecting to see these crazy things. And it can be really hard to break out of that and recognize a problem for being a problem when it starts.
Instead of part of the show.
This one, the fire started really small in this.
Okay.
Just kind of the size of a candle. And it started in a sidewall. That's pretty obviously not part of the show. So people in these contexts are not necessarily thinking it's part of the show. It's more like, oh, somebody else will take care of that. It's more, I'm here watching a show. I'm not in the middle of a fire.
Right.
And the book I read, actually, The Unthinkable, this week talks a lot about that and talks about how denial is often the first stage of a disaster where your brain just kind of shuts off. And there's good reason for that. It protects you. It keeps you from panicking from the very beginning. It gives you a moment to get your bearings. And sometimes that can be very useful. And she talks about it in terms of 9/11 in particular, where people were, as they were leaving the Twin Towers, they were in complete denial that this was a truly dangerous situation. And they were just calmly following the crowd because there was no real panic in the Twin Towers during the evacuation. People all went together nicely. And part of that is because of that denial switch in your brain, not letting you be scared. But in cases like this, in cases like the circus fire, where things go really bad really quickly, that denial can be quite dangerous. So that's a real component of what happens here, because the fire started really small, like the size of a penny or a small candle. It kind of depends on who you talk to, but everyone agreed. It wasn't suddenly growing. It wasn't suddenly huge. And people were noticing it when it was small before it took off.
You say it's on just sidewall. Like, what ignited it?
So we will get into that as we go forward.
Sorry for jumping ahead.
This is another one where we don't have conclusive answers on what started it. But we do know it started on the sidewall near the men's restroom. And it started, like I said, small. And then it grew to the size of a baseball, to the size of a watermelon, to a chair, to a couch, and bigger. And the descriptions of it vary from, a square to this to that. Like, everyone remembers it growing.
Right.
But, the way these things go, because you're not thinking straight.
Yep.
There's a lot of variation. Most of the people who were describing seeing it at first talked about how they saw it and turned and looked back at the show. They assumed somebody else was going to take care of it. They're in that denial stage going on here. And it was at this point, while the Wallendas are doing their aerial act and this fire is, even the size of a couch, that there was a real opportunity for them to stop it before it got too big. Fortunately, that did not happen.
Right.
Not only was the water truck not nearby, for some reason, the fire extinguishers that were supposed to be under the bleachers were not placed under the bleachers as well for this particular show.
Fun.
3 ushers from the north side of the tent spotted the fire while it was still, I would say, medium-sized, rushed behind the bleachers and tried to use the 4 gallons of water that were under the bleachers where they were supposed to be to put it out. But it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
The fire had spread too far at this point. They tried to pull the sidewall down to keep it from reaching that roof, which was waterproofed with gasoline and paraffin.
So the sidewall was not?
The sidewall was not. It's just the big top. The top part.
Okay.
Is treated with that. But they weren't able to get it down in time before it started to ignite the roof. So, all that can happen now.
Now, accelerant.
Get people out.
Yep.
That's all you can do to help people at this point. And they had experience with this. There was a 15,000 person tent that everyone was able to get out under very similar circumstances.
Yeah.
So that's what they started trying to do. This was the point where the Wallendas, who were up on the acrobatics, noticed the fire. And they signaled down in the middle of their act to the band and to other circus performers about there's a problem.
Yeah.
Hand sign language down to them. Merle Evans was trained to watch for these kinds of sign language. He's in charge of the band.
Yeah.
So when he saw that, he turned and looked and he saw the flames as well. So he stops the waltz that had been playing during the aerial act and has the band start playing Stars and Stripes Forever, which is a well-known circus song for danger. They play it whenever there's a big problem to alert all of the performers that something has gone terribly wrong without panicking the crowd.
Interesting.
Very, very interesting. Something I loved learning about while we were doing this. Folks started leaving at this point. The fire had gotten big enough for some people to snap out of that denial and start streaming out. Ushers are now starting to tell people, let's go, let's get out of here, telling them to go slowly. Everyone who works at the circus knows that there's a problem. Not only does everyone inside the big top know that there's a problem, everyone who's outside of the big top who works for the circus knows there's a problem and is on their way to help. In particular, we're going to talk more about it, but the clowns are all in their full makeup and they hear this and all of the clowns roll out to go help with what's going on. And that's why they have that song, to alert everyone and make sure everyone knows and they can start.
That's smart.
Very cool, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this is where things start to really go wrong and people really start to panic more than you would honestly really expect in a situation like this. And there's probably a lot of reasons for why that happened. But from everything I read and what I know about disasters, my guess would be the circus was not super organized at this point with the changing of ownership. And while they did have the Stars and Stripes playing, they didn't necessarily have the same ballet movements when it came to big problems because not everyone there was super experienced. There wasn't a lot of voices of authority saying, go here, directing people to
general
specific exits. Yep.
You don't have emergency jobs.
Exactly. So you're starting to see the beginnings of a stampede. It's not a full stampede yet, but people are starting to really worry that fire is getting bigger. It is very clearly not part of the show and not something that's normal. We're starting to get more pushing. You're starting to get more yelling and screaming. One of the bicycles from the aerial act fell down into the middle of the ring where the lions and the jaguars were. It's starting to get pretty scary. The roof is starting to wick at this point, so the flames are being pulled into the middle faster and faster.
Yeah.
And this is all within the course of a few minutes.
Uh-huh.
This is happening very, very quickly. Once the flames started to reach more of the middle of that roof, that beginnings of panic suddenly turned a corner and became a full-blown stampede and panic.
Because everything above you is flame.
And it's groupthink.
Yep.
Right? Everyone kind of realized at the same moment as one that they were truly in danger. People who were outside of the tent at this point said it sounded the same way applause would sound. A roar going through the entire big top because it happened all at once. Something really scary had just happened. Something in the show had just happened. And then it didn't stop the way it would. It continued at that frenetic pace. Emmett Kelly, one of the main clowns, a pretty famous one at that point, was just starting to come out of his tent when that roar erupted because he had heard the Stars and Stripes.
Yeah.
And when he looked out, he saw the fire and he immediately grabbed his pail of water that he was using to finish his clown makeup.
Yeah.
And would use at the end of the show to wipe it all off.
Right.
And took off to go try and pour this bucket of water on the tent. And this is, famous show. There's press all around at this point. There's this incredibly famous photo of Emmett Kelly carrying that bucket of water with the full clown paint makeup and the big top on fire in the background. It's going to be the main photo for this episode because it's just so emblematic of the chaos and just kind of bizarreness of this disaster. A clown carrying just one bucket of water to the tent that is clearly going up in flames. It is bad at this point. It's not completely engulfed, but it's obvious that it's not going well. Inside the tent, May Kovar still had 5 panthers on their stands who needed to be sent out, ideally without letting them loose on, the panicking crowd that's running through.
And I'm sure they're panicking now,
They're starting to, yeah. Her partner, Joseph Walsh, had 6 lions still up on the pyramid as well, needing to go out of the chutes.
Oh, wow.
The crowd had turned completely antisocial and individualistic. In the split second it took for that, groupthink of panic to roll through everyone, it had switched from the majority of folks calmly moving out to every man for himself and a stampede. As is often the case, crowds went for the exits they knew. In this case, the front exit where they came in and the exits where the animal chutes were that they were trying to get these panthers and lions out.
No.
It didn't take long for folks to start being straight up trampled in the chaos, particularly in the grandstands. Now, the grandstands at a circus like this are very steep. Yeah. And they're made that way on purpose so you can fit more people. So you see the domino effect. Yeah. One person panicking at the top sends an entire wave of people down those stairs, falling one on top of another into giant just piles of humanity. And interspersed amongst all of this, you had some folks still just not moving, looking completely shocked and dazed, stuck in that denial. They were few and far between, but they were there. You'd see
so
them.
Panicked, they're frozen.
Right. People talk about seeing them there. There was one gentleman who was described as still sitting in the grandstands saying, if everyone would just calm down, we could all get out of here just fine without moving at all, as just streams of people went by him trying to escape through these grandstands.
Huh.
The wind was blowing at this point and moving it up the seams of the big top at an incredibly alarming rate. Some folks started to realize that they could get out of the sidewalls behind the grandstands instead of going to these exits. So instead of going down, they started going up and jumping off of the back of the grandstands, which were about 12 to 15 feet high.
Okay. I was wondering how tall they were.
I mean, that's tall enough to hurt yourself.
Sure.
That's a little bit taller than a one-story building, but it's not so high that you're guaranteed to die.
Yeah. That would probably suck if you got landed on by someone behind you.
We're gonna get to
Yep,
you.
I figured.
And 12 to 15 feet, that's 18 rows. That's how many rows they fit in 12 to 18 feet. Just give you an idea of how steep these bleachers were. So, screaming, chaos, stampeding, people desperate to get out. Over the speaker system, the announcer tries to ask the audience to leave in an orderly fashion, but while he's putting that out there, the power goes out.
Oh.
Cuts off in the middle of it. The band is still playing Stars and Stripes, still on their stand, going to town, making sure, trying to almost Titanic it, but also make sure that everyone in the circus gets the message that there's a major problem. The track leading out the front entrance where most folks came in was the most crowded, but the canvas above it was also completely on fire, making everyone duck and burning a number of people's heads and backs as they rushed out of that one exit. Police outside and inside started cutting ropes, cutting canvas, anything they could do to open up more space at that front entrance to let more people out. As the flames ate more and more, parents started picking up their kids or holding their hands, trying to navigate their way through the pushing and pulsating mass of humanity going everywhere.
Kids.
In some of the front of the grandstand locations, a group of injured war veterans had come to the circus as a rehabilitation thing. And they were sitting in the chairs near that front entrance with their Red Cross nurses to see the circus, right? Some of them had lost limbs. Some of them were bumped and bruised. One of them had malaria and was recovering from getting malaria in the Pacific Theater, and they had come to see the circus. So the Red Cross volunteers tried to move these convalescing soldiers out of the big top. But a number of the soldiers just straight up said, fuck you, fuck this, I'm not leaving, and started picking up children and women and ferrying them out.
Good guys.
It's amazing. I love this story. Between them, they led a little over 30 children out of the tent as it burned, many of them suffering even more injuries as they did. Once they got out, Red Cross volunteers ended up restraining a number of them to keep them from going back into the burning tent because the area they were trying to go into was completely engulfed in flames. And I think that's an amazing story.
Oh, yeah.
That they had to do that. One mother in particular was the beneficiary of their work as they left the tent. She lost her 6-year-old in that mass of humanity. He was just knocked out of her arms as she was trying to get out. One of the sailors, these convalescing sailors, scooped him up, running behind her, and got him out of the tent and handed him back to his mother. So they both ended up okay because of this guy. Just kind of amazing. One older woman had a harder time. She ended up falling through the bleachers and was caught by her foot hanging upside down.
Oh, no.
One of the police officers found her and was able to lift her up and get her out. So she was no longer hanging upside down. She broke an ankle, but she was able to get out of the tent.
Yeah.
Much of the crowd started to swell where the animal chutes were as well, which, reminder, they're still sending lions and panthers out at this point. Folks started trying to climb up and over them to get out, and feet and legs were popping through in danger of being mauled by things.
Yeah.
Donald Gale was with his neighbor, Hulda Grant, and with her daughter, Caroline, and Hulda Grant's boyfriend. They all held hands together. Caroline was holding hands with the boyfriend, and Donald Gale with Hulda. The crowd fuddled everyone the same way, but as they made it to the bottom of the grandstands, panic really started to set in for that group. A huge sailor, this is not a good one, in uniform, broke through, punching his way through to the front of the crowd. He hit Hulda in the jaw, broke it, and sent her falling into the chairs. Donald lost his hold on her and went down with the folks trampling over him.
Oh.
Donald ends up okay. This same situation, though, happened all over the tent, with the bigger people knocking down smaller people to get out.
Yeah.
Donald Cook tried to take his sister Eleanor down the grandstands, but as they were going down, his mother caught Eleanor's other hand, so she was holding both Eleanor and her other son Edward's hand, taking them a different direction, and told Donald to catch up with them once he was able to get through more of the crowd. He tried to go down, but he realized pretty quickly that the way his mother and his siblings went wasn't going to work, so he went back up over the back and jumped off of the back of that. They all lost sight of each other in the chaos of all of this. Dawn was not the only one who took the route of going over the back of the grandstands. Folks started standing at the bottom to catch children and women who were jumping, but many broken ankles, backs, and necks were had trying to leap down in the chaos of this. And the people at the bottom were getting a lot of bumps and bruises as well from people landing on them that it wasn't accidental. They were trying to catch them.
Yes.
Trying to save them. The Eppses and Goffs went over the back. Maybelle Epps had William go over and then dropped Richard down to him, then little Muriel. Once William had the two smaller kids, Mabel told him to run. He lifted the folds so they could crawl out of the side of the tent. All the while, the fire was rushing like a grass fire through the canvas roof. The tent acted like a chimney. It sucked the cooler air in the bottom, feeding it to the fire up top, and the paraffin acted as an accelerant, and the big roof provided endless oxygen, so the temperature inside of the tent was heating up the same way that a chimney does. So people were literally cooking, broiling alive inside of this. Some of the circus personnel were absolutely heroic, rescuing children from other circus goers. Others were smashing people's cameras as they took photos.
Okay, got it.
Children were being trampled, so circus performers were prioritizing children and rescuing them from the other circus goers who were doing things. But then there were other circus performers who, instead of rescuing children, were smashing people's cameras, trying to keep photos from happening during all of this, which was something that just kind of bugged me.
They don't want bad press because it's going to affect their livelihood. Yeah.
That kind of bugged me. Outside of the tent now, folks who had made it out were trying to pull other people out through the sidewall and do whatever they can. Many of them already had pretty horrific burns, 3rd, 4th degree. Many children and their parents and caregivers were separated. The crush wasn't there, but there was still full pandemonium.
Yeah.
Outside of the tent as well. In the northwest corner of the lot sat the circus's water trucks instead of near the tent where they should be. Deacon Blanchfield was supposed to have them on hand during the performance, but he had forgotten. I want you to remember Deacon Blanchfield is the one we quoted in the very beginning of the episode. By this point, the local fire volunteers in Hartford were getting calls and starting to try and make their way to the scene along with the rest of Hartford's police department. And with that, the press was also being notified and making their way to the scene to join their brethren who were already there. Yeah. There's videos and photos of this whole fire, by the way.
Videos?
Like early videos,
right, because it's World War II,
But you can see them. Folks were really trying to make their way out of the chutes in earnest now, climbing up and over and occasionally being a little mauled by the big cats inside while the circus performers tried to rush them out when their feet slipped through the bars. At one point, May Kovar's Panthers, 2 of whom I guess had like beef, started fighting in the chute because she sent them in at the same time, trying to get them out as quickly as possible. So they started fighting inside of the chute, and May Kovar went in and got them separated with her tiny wand and sent one off and then the other one, and was able to keep them from mauling each other and other people.
Jesus.
Fucking badass.
Yeah.
After she did that, the last panther in the cage tried to turn on her and attack her, but May Kovar was able to kind of turn and jump and get the cat into the chute when it launched at her and shut it behind the cat and get the cat all the way onto the truck instead. While everything's fucking burning and there's people climbing all over this thing and like just bananas. Once all of the cats were out, Kovar turned to helping people out of the chute exit, particularly helping children and young women, lifting them up and over the chute so they could get out over the top of it and out of the tent at that point. The fire continued to eat the roof pole by pole, turning the entire tent into that broiler, cooking people alive. So it ate through more rope and pieces, and parts of it started falling down, trapeze equipment, just flaming bits falling into the people below. Mildred Cook ended up losing her hold on Eleanor in the mob at the bottom of the grandstand. She hoped that Eleanor found Dawn, but ended up running with Edward to the front door, hoping to duck under the fire. Both Mildred and Edward passed out from the heat before they made it out of the tent.
Oh.
As more folks jumped off the back of the grandstands because of the other exits being so crowded, those near the front entrances were confronted with sidewall that was nailed down to avoid folks sneaking in. 13-year-old Donald Anderson was a Boy Scout.
There we go, Boy Scout.
He had a fishing knife on him and cut through the canvas so that he could get out. And once he got out, people started piling out behind him and getting out that way. He realized, though, that his buddy was still inside the tent, so he cut another hole to go back in get his buddy. And he was able to spot his friend.
Yeah.
Within a few seconds of being in there, his friend had been a little trembled and pulled his friend out. But he's one of He had a lot of newspaper stories and stuff written about him for his
heroism
thinking with that. And I don't want to discount what this 13-year-old kid did. It was amazing. But this was also the time where a lot of kids and a lot of men carried knives on them. There were a lot of people doing the same thing, which is amazing. And doing it on purpose to let people out. And he's the one who gets a lot of credit for it, and he absolutely deserves it for sure. But he wasn't the only one. There was people all over the tent doing that. Even where it wasn't staked down, though, there was still some challenges depending on what part of the tent you were at. On one side, the circus wagons were lined up alongside the tent so that folks had to crawl under them or over them to get out of the tent. On the other side, much of the menagerie was pushed up against the tent. So people had to climb into like the elephant enclosure from the sidewall to get out and go through there. One family
So it wasn't just like lift up the flap and run.
Some places it was, but some places it wasn't.
And you didn't know until you got there.
You could see if it was lifted up already, but if it wasn't lifted up yet, you didn't know. You lifted it up and hope for the best. One family ended up coming out in the middle of the elephants, like an entire family of 6 people.
Yeah.
And the elephants at that point started rearing and trumpeting and like stomping around the cage. The family was able to get out uninjured, but can you imagine escaping a fire and ending up under like stampeding elephants?
That's terrifying.
It was horrific. It wasn't long after that family emerged and a few others in the elephant enclosure that trainers got the elephants to go what's called tail to trunk, where they line up and march them off into a field that had victory gardens for Hartford, Connecticut.
Okay.
So the elephants were trampling these poor people's victory gardens as well, but at least they weren't trampling people on fire.
It's true.
Like, it's a
better trample of the tulips than...
It's just important to say because, like, just the chaos of that.
Oh, yeah.
If you're out of it, you come out into the elephant enclosure. And even if you didn't come out into the elephant enclosure, you're like half burned. And there's, 6 elephants being frog marched into another field. And I can't even imagine. Don Cook, he's Eleanor and Edward's brother, made it out over the grandstand, Section K. He was able to slip out of the sidewall and made his way completely out. He was confronted by seared people, some who were still on fire, and mass chaos when he went off in search of his mother and his siblings. Officers on the scene tried to corral people off the road so that fire trucks and ambulances could make their way up, but it was really hard to do when people are not only scared of fire, but also terrified that lions might get loose and eat them.
Yeah.
People are just running everywhere.
I mean, till recently, there were some lions that were indeed loose.
So they weren't technically loose the way the ring is set up. They had like a cage over it.
Okay.
But they very easily could have gotten loose.
Yeah.
And I personally would also be terrified of lions getting loose because it just feels like something that could happen in a moment like that.
Oh,
it didn't, though, thankfully.
Oh, I mean, even modern day, what city was it that had like a pack of lions running through it recently that escaped from the zoo?
Is that a real fucking thing? Tell me that's not a thing.
I think it actually happened.
I'm going to have to Google that.
All
right, pause. I'm going to Google this shit. Well, no, I have a new fear unlocked because this has happened in multiple towns, like Sydney and a place in Italy. The one in Detroit was debunked, and it looks like Pittsburgh is a maybe. I'll have to dig into this more. I'll put it on the Facebook somewhere or like in the pod notes or something.
Yeah, if you have information, let us know.
Also that, yes, please let me know if lions escape near you because now I also need to be afraid of that. So that's good to know. Anyways, in the Hartford Circus Fire, that didn't happen.
Okay.
But it was a real concern. One boy was thrown to the ground from the top of the bleachers. He didn't jump. He was like tossed off by people trying to escape. He managed to pull himself under the bleachers to escape being trampled and was shocked to find a tiny baby sitting underneath the bleachers completely alone.
What?
He picked the baby up and carried it outside in the mass of humanity. Very shortly after he made it out of the tent, the baby's father rushed over, took the baby from him, and ran off.
Oh,
he never found out who the baby was, but
Oh.
That kind of stuff was happening all over.
Oh my God, I can
just chaos.
Unfortunately, I can imagine that father, like somehow, I don't know how, but like you'll lose your damn baby,
right? In a fire with lions.
I know the experience. I know you do too, of losing a child briefly because they ran off or something.
We're gonna tangent here because I've ruined your life. We're gonna talk about one of our children in particular, one of our twins, and I'm not gonna name names, but if you know us, if you know, you know.
You know.
This child is unbelievably fucking adept at disappearing in silence. Like, he doesn't run off. He's just there 1 minute and then he's not. And what made it even worse when he was younger is he didn't just like go on a joyride and run for things. He just went to find places to fucking nap.
Yeah.
There was one time we went to a fire station, and it was this fucking day. It was such a bad day. Arin was deployed. And I saw this ad on Facebook for a pancake breakfast at the firehouse, and it was going to be like $5 or something like that. And I had 3 toddlers at the time, and I was like, that sounds like fun. I'm going to go, and I'm going to take my babies to see the fire trucks because they love this stuff. I get there, and it is a pancake breakfast, but it's a pancake breakfast for the firefighters and their families.
Yep.
Which I was not.
Not for the pup.
I just fucking showed up with 3 babies, and they were so incredibly nice, like very confused, but like, cool, come join, sure. Come hang out. So we're there. My babies are out of their goddamn minds. So the other twin, not the one who disappears, the crazy one, starts getting up on a chair and like dancing while I'm dealing with the other older child. And the chair completely collapses in on him, which I'll be real. Being in a firehouse full of firefighters and paramedics is pretty much the best place for your toddler to collapse a chair on himself, because we had like 15 paramedics rush to the aid of this 3-year-old. But by the time we realized that twin was okay, the other twin was fucking gone. And now I've got every firefighter in Oak Harbor now looking for my baby. And we're going through this damn firehouse and like, where are you? Where are you? And finally one of them finds him. He had found the bunk room and gotten on a top bunk under the blankets and fallen asleep. And then let's add another story to this, because there's another one. I took them all, because I have a death wish, to one of those like national night outs. I think you were with me on this one.
Yeah.
And we went to go see, all the police cars and this kind of stuff, because they're little kids. They love that stuff. And we turned around and that kid was fucking gone. And this is where we lived at the time, was Whidbey Island. Everyone kind of knew everyone. So like all these firefighters knew my kid.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'll never forget that child being found in the fire station. And there was one cop that like my oldest had fallen in love with, because they had seen each other at like parades and stuff.
Yeah.
And he was there too. So they all were like, oh, that kid's missing. We know that kid. And they all spread out. So we have like the entirety, all the police force, everything. And do you know where they found him? They fucking found him in an ambulance on the stretcher, asleep. He went and took another nap. And I'm sorry to completely tangent and just talk about my kids, but it's just it's relatable. He's 9 now and doesn't do it quite that bad. Like, it's still not great, but it's not quite that bad. And he does think about it. And he also doesn't go nap, because that was the hardest part. It's not like he was wandering going, where's my mommy? No, he's under the blankets having good dreams. Like, oh, I fucked my mom's life up again. Time to have a good nap.
All that to say, I understand the panic that dad must have felt, and then seeing your son, like,
suddenly your son's fine.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, my heart is just. Ugh.
That's how I felt when I found him in the fire station and in the ambulance. Anyways.
Yeah.
That baby's fine.
Got it.
Thank goodness.
Backing out to get back on track.
I know, right? Police officers started to try and collect stray children at this stage. A number of them literally just took off and ran all the way home, or were running around just confused as heck. And random strangers were like collecting children and bringing them to police officers. Like, this is not my child. What do I do with this child? So they started putting them in like one central spot in police cars, trying to keep them all together. It wasn't going super great, but they were trying at this point to get all of them together.
The ultimate herding of cats.
While they're doing that, they're also trying to keep people from running back into the tent looking for loved ones, because you're starting to get a crush of people trying to get back in because they can't find their loved ones, trying to go in and rescue them. So it's pretty chaotic. William Epps, as they were making it out, lost his grip on his little cousin Muriel. He couldn't get back to her once they lost their grip because of the crush. And he and his little brother Richard were spat out literally over the top of the crowd out the front of the tent. His mother, Mabel Epps, jumped off the bleachers with no one to break her fall. She tried to turn in midair to protect the 7-month baby boy, but ended up landing hard and then managed to drag herself out of the canvas with a broken pelvis.
Oh my God.
Maurice Goff, Muriel's mother, made it out unscathed, but when she couldn't find Muriel, went back into the burning tent to try and find her daughter. Circus performers had now formed a bucket brigade. Each had a wash bucket that they were using to ferry water as fast as they could from the other structures to keep the fire from spreading from the big top to other areas of the tent.
Ooh.
Emmett Kelly, the clown we talked about earlier, was holding canvas aside and pulling people out from inside of the big top. The band is still playing inside the big top as well at this point.
They hadn't moved at this?
They had not moved yet. It's very Titanic, this band. Like, they all survive and they end up coming out. But they played until almost when the tent collapsed.
It's crazy.
Pretty bananas. The grandstands by this stage are starting to catch fire, along with those chairs that are dipped in just years of flammable materials. One of the circus workers, Curly, got on top of the chute and started tossing children out of the tent as fast as they could be handed to them, literally tossing them like sacks of potatoes as fast as he could.
Yeah, just get them
bracing
out.
On this, it's the chute, right? So it's got holes in it. It's like a big metal fencing top, and he's standing on it, throwing kids out like potato sacks. Unlike Donald Anderson and May Kovar, he ended up being a pretty tragic hero. At one point, when he lifted the last child, his foot slipped between the bars, and when he fell, the crowd dragged him under, and he was trampled to death.
Oh, my God.
Flames were spreading down the side walls now that on the opposite side of the tent. The flames above Section 8 in the center poles holding the whole thing together were starting to sway and move, and only the east end of the tent was fully standing. The flag on top of the tent, the big American flag, was now on flame, aflame as well.
Ooh.
And pretty clearly about to fall in with tons and tons of folks inside. A clown dragged a 10-year-old to safety. A man picked up a 13-year-old girl and carried her out despite him tearing at her face because she had been searching for his brother when he dragged her out of the tent. They and the last folks that were able to make it out before the tent collapsed were pretty horrifically burned. We talked about the difference between first, second, and third, fourth-degree burns. We're looking at third and fourth-degree burns at this point. There was no water nearby that could be spared to splash onto these burning victims. So they were starting to use pink lemonade. People that were coming out on fire or burned to cool them off, they're being doused with pink lemonade.
Oh, wow.
Circus pink lemonade. Survivors wandered barefoot in tattered clothes, coughing up sooty mucus. By the southeast exit, the Coca-Cola top caught on fire, and it burned so hot that the bottles melted and flowed to the floor like water. The glass.
Whoa.
High up, the guy ropes parted, and the poles slumped in on themselves to the center of the canvas. This is the point where the band runs out and starts playing outside of the tent.
Wow.
They get out as it's collapsing. Like it's starting to collapse. And they go out and they keep playing Stars and Stripes Forever, both to try and calm the crowd down and to just kind of, normalcy. I don't even know. But it's pretty amazing to me that they kept doing it and that they made it out and they kept going. But then...
I also suppose it gives them a task.
Gives them something to do, yeah.
Yeah.
The tent sagged, not all at once, and then with a hissing and swishing sound, the tent fell in on itself, crushing people, grandstands, and animal cages. This collapse was caught on film by Robert Ornato, and it's absolutely chilling. Other folks had cameras out too. There's a really, truly shocking number of photos of the event from the beginning to end, many of which are extremely graphic.
Wow.
And I post a lot of photos. I will not be posting the graphic ones for this because they are very, very graphic. So proceed with caution if you decide to Google it. The last few folks popped out of the tent, badly burned, but not everyone escaped. Many watched it fall, not knowing where their loved ones were. Inside, folks were stacked on top of each other, trapped. The flames crackled over it all and the screaming got worse. A number of survivors say that the only thing that they'll never forget about the circus fire is the sound that the animals made when they burned after the tents collapsed. Unfortunately, we know now that there were no animals inside of that tent.
Oh.
All of them got out.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, guys. It's a good disaster, though. It's interesting. Folks were still trying to make sure that others' tents didn't catch, or things like the light plant generators that were nearby and filled with diesel fuel.
Oh.
Trying to make sure that doesn't catch on fire.
Yeah.
Engine Company 7 was the first to arrive, and they arrived after the tent collapsed, and there wasn't enough space for that fire engine or any others. So they had to run lines of hose from the street all the way to the big tent, a couple hundred feet, to be able to start using them. The governor and the mayor arrived shortly after the tent collapsed because Connecticut is a small state, and started pitching in and helping immediately as well. One of the best parts of this disaster, and one of the reasons I like it so much, is after the Coconut Grove fire and because of the war, the state of Connecticut had this really well thought out mass casualty plan for if there was any kind of major disaster, whether it was war-related or, an industrial accident or whatever. And they were able to start putting that into action really quickly. It included things like nearly every department store in town or anyone with a big truck had these makeshift stretchers that they could put into their big trucks. And they were to go to wherever the scene was and start loading people in as makeshift ambulances to get them to the hospital as quickly as possible. And once the victims made it to the hospitals, they would come back and start ferrying the bodies to wherever the morgue was. Yeah. The morgue had already been designated. There was a place called the Armory in town.
Okay.
And that was planned to be a makeshift morgue if there was ever a mass casualty event. So they had, stretchers and different things to be able to take care of all this stuff. And they also had a large supply of blood, of plasma, of penicillin, of bandages stockpiled for any mass disaster. And they had them just on hand. So they were able to, within, less than an hour, the mayor and the governor are there putting this plan into action. The phone tree is going off. These people are coming. And while, it sounds awful that the tent collapsed before they get there, this was fast.
Oh, yeah.
And they were there very quickly. And Fire Engine 7 was the first, but you start seeing, there's a florist. I think it's Atina, and it's still an ambulance service in Connecticut to this day. And it started at this fire as a florist truck that came to go rescue people from it.
Interesting.
So there were people starting to leave to go to local hospitals very, very quickly. Putting out the fire, though, took some time because those hoses took so long. There wasn't easy access to water. It wasn't helped by how flammable everything was. The chairs took a long time to foot. The chairs took a long time in particular to put out because there was just so many layers of that flammable paint. There were some folks that did survive inside of the tent.
Really?
Primarily folks who were trapped at the bottom of piles of bodies that had an air pocket of some sort.
Oh, wow. Ugh.
But some of those people at the bottom almost drowned because of how much water the firefighters were putting on. And a couple of them were only found when they started yelling, "Please don't drown me," because the water was filling up amongst all of the bodies. And they were like, "Don't, stop, get me out."
Wow. I mean, talk about a scarring experience.
Right. Once the fire was out, the first step was to try and get to those who were alive. So the policemen and firemen who were there worked on the piles of bodies that had formed at those main exits. And like I said, more than one lucky person was found.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until after they really went through those bodies that they started going into the main part of the tent itself. William Surrey was one of the first inside of the tent to fully kind of try and look around for more survivors. And what he describes is just unreal. Unreal. One of the first things they found was a boy kneeling, dead, looking like he was in prayer, with his head resting on the bleachers. He wasn't charred at all. He didn't look burned, but the back of his head had split open like an egg that had been boiled.
Oh my God.
Just popped.
Ooh.
Other bodies were charred beyond recognition with their arms and legs sticking up. This is called pugilistic posturing. When the heat is so intense, your muscles contract. And a lot of people who burn to death are in that posture where it's almost like the fetal position.
Yeah.
Your arms and legs are sticking out because literally every muscle in your body has been contracted by heat.
Oh, wow. Wow. Oh, God.
In the center of the ring lay a middle-aged man who had been cut in half by a pole that had been fallen. One half of his body was at the top and the other half was at the bottom.
Oh, wow.
Moving the bodies was rough. There was a lot of slippage of skin. There was a lot of hands, feet, legs, arms that had either burned off entirely or fallen off. A number of folks were fused together like cooled lava. So they separated the living from the dead. Clowns and sooty face paint helped. There was a number of clowns working on this, and it's part of why this is called the day the clowns died, because...
The clowns cried or died?
No, the clowns cried. I think a few of the clowns died. But I meant to say the day the clowns cried. But the clowns helped separate the bodies and get them together. And there's some really intense photos of that happening. Most of the folks from inside were dead. There were 60 to 70 people matted at the club at the one shoot on their own. Some burned so severely that identification was nearly impossible. A lot of survivors described the smell
Oh.
And again, they thought it was burning animal flesh, but there were no animals inside of the tent.
Oh.
There were a number of bodies under the bleachers as well. Huldah Grant lay among them somewhere, deceased, along with many others like Edward Cook and Muriel Goff, along with her mother. So that is the main disaster part. Do you need a minute before we talk about the aftermath?
Oh.
The aftermath gets pretty gruesome, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Not as bad, I don't think, but yeah, you're talking about a lot of dead bodies, so.
Yeah, that's, man.
One of the worst parts of this is in many structure fires, most people die from asphyxiation. Pretty much no one died from asphyxiation here. They were either crushed, trampled to death, broken bones, or for the most part, burned alive. Or
baked, apparently.
I mean, I would count that in the same category. But asphyxiation is a pretty peaceful death. This was not that.
Yeah.
This is part of why this one is so horrific. Just because in a structure fire, all of the oxygen gets sucked out.
Yeah.
And you pass out before you can really feel burning. But when you're outside like this, you're getting the same sucking as a structure fire. So you're broiling the way you would in a structure fire. But oxygen is also coming in, so you're still breathing. You're not passing out. And that's how the majority of people died, was being burned alive or heat of some sort.
Wow.
So pretty awful. The police officers pretty quickly decided to take any lost children they found to the Brown School in town.
Okay.
And started trying to put out to the community, if you lost a kid, check here first.
Yeah.
Come see what you can do. They started trying to take down names, and these are the kids who were not burned. These are kids that were okay.
Yeah.
Kids who were burned were taken to some of the local hospitals. There was just pandemonium. The phone lines were mostly overwhelmed. It was pretty impossible to get through on those. There's not easy dissemination of information. While the town had that wonderful plan, and they were able to get people to medical care really quickly.
Yeah.
Getting information out to the general public was...
And finding your people.
Yeah.
If they survived.
But there was a lot of folks who started trying to fill that gap as well, giving people rides home or rides to the hospital. There was all of those ambulances going on. There was a lot of stories of folks taking kids home and their parents finding out that the circus had caught on fire when their kids showed up without whoever took them, but alive. Bodies were being carried out.
That's it. I couldn't imagine. That'd be a way to find out.
Up on your step and not with their aunt or uncle or grandma, just alone and sooty.
Yeah.
Bad day. Bodies were also being carried out to the waiting makeshift ambulances, police cars, etc., taken to that armory on Broad Street. Folks seeing this is probably a lot of what fueled the rumors of animals being what died in the tent, because so many of those bodies were in that pugilistic position.
Yeah.
And that pugilistic position does look like paws sticking up. There were a number of folks who didn't realize how burned they were and tried to help as well. Because we talked about this, 3rd and 4th degree burns.
You can't feel it. All your nerves are gone.
So there is a lot of arguing between police officers and makeshift ambulance workers and circus workers and people who are dripping skin that you probably should go to the hospital. No, you can't do this. No, you can't go to this person. And there's a lot of stories of that, of there's one of this mom, she's on her knees talking to her kid who's sobbing his eyes out, and both of them have 3rd degree burns, but what they're sobbing about is that what he's sobbing about is he can't find his program. And she's trying to comfort him, and they're both clearly severely injured, and they got to the hospital and those two were okay. But lots of moments like that. Even with the preparedness that they had, a number of folks and bodies did get lost in the massive shuffle. Little Raymond Erickson, the one whose shoe lace broke and his mom had to retie it, he made it out with his uncle.
Okay.
Alive, but barely. And his uncle got him to the hospital. His uncle left him there and then went back to go and try and find the rest of the family who had been at the circus. And it seems that little Raymond must have passed away at some point while he was at the hospital.
Oh, no.
Because when his uncle came back, Raymond wasn't there. And it took several days of them looking and trying to figure out what happened. And it wasn't until they went to that makeshift morgue and found his little shoe with the broken shoelace and the effects of the victims that they realized he must have died, but his body wasn't there, which means his body was likely, there's a number of cases, and we're going to get into it here because this is pre-DNA, that were misidentified. So the best guess for little Raymond is that somebody else claimed his body and buried it. Lots of little stories like that. People mobbed the hospitals and the morgue to try and find their lost loved ones. The identification process was mostly based on either personal effects, dental records, which were limited at the time, or just general look at the person and say who it is.
Yeah.
And particularly for look at the person and say who it is, that's really difficult with burns, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also really difficult for the people who were trampled to death. Being trampled and having that much trauma to your bones and your muscles makes you pretty unrecognizable. Ooh. So it was a very imperfect system. They did the best they could, but it showed, and there's a number of clearly misidentified bodies that the list of who's missing and who was left of the unidentified bodies does not match up, right? The armory itself was large. It was chosen for this purpose. So it was a huge space, and the size of the ceilings did help dissipate some of that charred burning smell. Ooh. But it was pretty awful. They tried to put the bodies in specific groupings so that folks who were searching for loved ones wouldn't have to search through all of the bodies, just, the little girls, for example, or the little boys, or the young women. But this wasn't always possible. Some bodies were so badly burned that it was pretty difficult to tell which category they fell into at all.
Yeah.
So they had a section for people that were just unrecognizable. We can't know. And then had their personal effects that they could recover / dental records to try and figure those. The staff also tried to notate things like height, weight, and age with burned bodies. This can be really hard.
Yeah.
First of all, skin contracts with that much heat. Makes it more difficult to see what's going on. And in a number of cases, feet or parts of legs burned off and fell off. It's hard to tell how tall someone is when you don't have all of that.
Yeah.
Some bodies, though, were in absolutely great condition and identified relatively quickly. There was one little girl. Her name, what she's called now, is Miss 1565.
Okay.
Miss 1565, everyone thought she would be identified right away. The only burn she had on her was a little bit on one of her cheeks, and her photo ends up getting printed in papers for years and years after this. It's a very famous photo from the fire.
Okay.
She looks like she could be sleeping.
Huh.
Like, she does not look that damaged, but she was... We're going to get into what happens with her, but she was not identified. She was buried unidentified, and there's a whole saga for Miss 1565. But it took a long time to... And I say we don't know. But yeah. In total, the fire claimed 167 lives. Initial reports from the time claimed that there was 168. The reason for this is because while they were trying to get everything sorted at the morgue, they had one bag for the miscellaneous body parts. And the funeral, or the main guy, the medical examiner, labeled that as corpse number 1. And so any random body part got thrown in that bag. And when it was cremated, it was notated as corpse number 1 being cremated, but it wasn't one corpse. It was just pieces of people. So 167 total.
So 100, that's out of 6,000.
It's not bad in terms of the number of people who died, right there. I think from what I can tell, there's more deaths overall when you take into account long-term effects. But that's from the immediate... And it's not just found in the tent. That's people that died in the hospitals, too, from their burns.
Okay.
But it is a relatively small amount for what it seems like it would be at that point.
Yeah. It's a lot.
It's a lot of people. So let's kind of go. I want to talk about Miss 1565, and then we'll talk about some of the after effects of the fire, some of the loss and whatnot. So there's really good evidence. I mean, it's obvious that a number of the bodies were misidentified. Yeah. Clearly, Raymond Erickson was misidentified. So Miss 1565, though, because she was there were so little burns on her. She was so seemingly recognizable. She became kind of an obsession for a number of people over the years. And it's a story that revamped every 10 to 20 years over the years to try and figure out who she was.
Because why would she not be claimed or
Why
identified?
Would she not be claimed? Yeah. Miss 1565, or a number of people from the beginning thought that she was Eleanor Cook, Don Cook's little sister. Edward had died in the fire, and the last she was seen was running out with them. But Eleanor Cook was an 8-year-old who was tall for her age. Right? Little Miss 1565 was about the height of an average 6-year-old. And there's a lot of evidence that the dental records didn't match up between the two as well. A lot of people thought that it was her. In fact, there is such a strong sentiment of it, one of the more recent, deep dives into it was in 1991 with a renewed effort to figure out who it was. And even in 1991, they used some pretty fucking dubious techniques to figure out what it was. They used comparing facial features with relatives and things like that. And they were somehow able to determine in a court of law that 1565 was absolutely Eleanor Cook. And they were able to do it so much that they got permission to have her disinterred and buried next to Edward.
Who is they?
I forget the name of the guy. It's a journalist who really got into it and pushed it. And then her brother Donald was on board with it.
Okay.
But most of the rest of the family was not on board with it, did not believe, her aunt didn't believe that this was Eleanor, but enough people did and petitioned the court that she, Miss 1565 is now, on paper, Eleanor Cook, and buried next to Edward Cook. And I'm sorry, her mother didn't die. Edward Cook died in the fire, but Mom didn't die. And Mom didn't really ever seem to believe that it was Eleanor, but she's buried there now.
Okay.
And that's one of the ones that I kind of look at and I'm like,
If Mom doesn't believe it.
I mean, Mom never came out and officially said she didn't believe it, but her behavior and the way she acted towards it makes a lot more sense if she's going, that's not my baby.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, Eleanor Cook was a tall 8-year-old. 8 to 6, height-wise, big difference, especially a tall 8-year-old to a regular size 6-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
And then the dental didn't match. Eleanor had I think it was 6 permanent teeth, and Miss 1565 had 4 permanent teeth.
Oh,
there's a good amount of evidence that it's not. But, do your own research or, take my opinion, whatever you want. There's both sides of the argument there. I'm just stating what I think. I don't think it's Eleanor Cook. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The circus fire led to some real changes in fireproofing laws, particularly for circuses.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, there's a waterproofing technique that the Navy, the Coast Guard, ships used at that time that was not flammable. But circuses didn't have access to those materials because of the war and rationing. So those restrictions were lifted, and circuses were able to use the same waterproofing methods that our military does to their big tops. And that changed across the board for all circuses. They also required more inspections. They required to have better marked exits. There was a number of different laws that changed, and that's part of why we have smaller tents now. That didn't happen right there, but this was the beginning of changing in circus laws that led to having smaller tent.
Probably restriction on the number of people that could be in.
Yeah. So lots of different changes for the circuses. Yeah. It took a long time for the circus to make its way back to Connecticut, even though it had been such a staple for obvious reasons. But the circus did continue on after that. It did not fall apart. It was up and going within a couple of weeks of the circus fire. Running and rolling, which is kind of bananas to me. Police in Ohio arrested a man named Robert Dale Seegey in 1950, so 6 years later. Under interrogation, Seegey, who was a former circus employee who worked at the 1944 performance in Hartford, confessed to starting the fire. He also confessed to starting fires in Maine and New Hampshire and a number of other places, and even to committing 4 murders.
Damn.
Several of these fires were able to be confirmed, but the Hartford fire was not able to be confirmed as him starting it.
Did he say why?
He said he was mad about being fired, the same way those other people earlier in the story that we talked about, that he had been fired and so he lit it on fire. He also was clearly a little insane. He talked about how he was being followed by a red horseman who told him to start fires when he was upset. And that's why he did it. So there's a good chance that this guy was also schizophrenic or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, at the risk of armchair psychologizing.
Right.
There was something going on with him that was not completely stable. So he ended up being committed to an insane asylum as well. And years later, he ended up recanting his confession. This is another one that I look at it and go, there's real evidence that he started other fires. There's real evidence that he committed those murders. I think there's a good chance that he is the reason this fire started. There was other tests done. It was proven pretty conclusively that the fire couldn't have started from a cigarette because of how humid it was that day. There's a chance it could have been a match in the men's restroom. Like if somebody threw a match out in there in the trash can, that's what started it, or somebody threw out a match after lighting their cigarette, that could have started it. But from what I read, arson seems like a pretty likely explanation.
Yeah.
And somebody who is clearly a serial arsonist confessing to it, even if he did recant it later. I don't know.
Yeah.
I buy that.
I think there's a good chance.
Yeah. Innocent until proven guilty and all of that.
Sure.
Let's not
why did he recant? Why did he say, no,
he just said he didn't do it. Like, he changed his mind later. There wasn't any, like, precipitating event that made him say it. He just later, when he was being interviewed by journalists, was like, never mind, I didn't do it. I did do all these other ones, but not that one.
Weird.
Yeah, it is. It's odd. So, I mean, there's no conclusive evidence on why that happened. The official reason was never proven. The most credible theories, like I said, are Robert Seegey, a cigarette or a match in the men's room that rested against the big top, or a match from somebody nearby. Couldn't have been a cigarette, but there's no real, like, conclusive evidence. There was a huge, big trial. A number of people were actually arrested. And we're pushing 2 hours again, so I'm not going to go crazy into it. But people did serve jail time for this, primarily for not having the fire extinguishers and not having safety protocols, people from the circus.
Yeah.
And the circus was actually fined for this.
Okay.
I think there's good reason for that, but also this is not the station nightclub fire in that regard. Even when you look over the court transcripts.
Yeah.
Like, there was disorganization, there was neglect. You have to call it neglect. But it wasn't, I don't think it was greed-based. From everything I saw, I think it was just poor planning, and they deserved to be tried. They deserved to go to jail, but they got manslaughter charges, first-degree murder. And I feel like justice was served in this case, personally, in a good way, and not like overhanded.
Negligence instead of like
we could all be guilty of things like this. It's important to be aware of your surroundings. Yeah. It's important to do the best you can. But the reality is we all make mistakes sometimes. I've left the oven on overnight.
I know this.
I know. And I try not to, and I felt really bad, and I made serious changes when I've done that. But the stuff creeps back in, right? Yeah. And you've done stuff like that. We've all done stuff like that. And this felt like that in a lot of ways, that the worst of the choices made here was how to waterproof the circus top.
Yes, definitely.
And that's the biggest
problem.
Let's put
gasoline.
And after the menagerie fire, not pushing to figure out a better way, because they had a whole big top built between the menagerie fire and this fire.
Yeah.
They knew how bad that was, and they didn't push for a different way to waterproof. So that's where I think the worst of the neglect comes in, and why I think, this wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just a thing that happened. This was people making poor choices. So
yeah, I think that's probably where the greed comes in. There is like it's more maybe not even greed, but like a lack of we know this works for waterproofing. No, we don't need to change it. We'll just pay attention.
We'll just keep going.
And we'll look, no one died.
Yep.
And
until they did.
And look, we got the water trucks. The water trucks get parked next to it all the time. Yeah. So
and Donald, Deacon, was the big reason he was convicted, was because he didn't have the fire extinguishers or the water trucks nearby, and that's legit.
Yeah.
So that is the story of the Hartford Circus Fire. How you doing? Did I ruin your life?
Good. Horrifying descriptions. Well done. Oof.
Gives you chilly chills, huh?
Yeah.
You want to go to the circus?
No.
I'm excited for the circus this summer.
I mean, that circus is pretty fun.
Every time we go in, the last time we went to that circus, I don't know if you remember, they have these big fans in the middle, and one of the fans started sparking.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. I was
sitting there, and I'm so sorry. Our dear friend was there with us, and she's going to be listening to this episode. I'm so sorry to tell you that the only thing going through my mind at that moment when we were laughing about the sparking fans was this fire. I was thinking about it all the way, and they handled it quickly. So,
they did. They were on it, and
But I don't know if you
corrected
heard
the issue.
But the band played Stars and Stripes Forever when that started sparking.
Did they?
Yeah.
I didn't. No.
It only played for a couple of bars.
Well,
but
probably.
They played it, and immediately there was 3 or 4 people that came out and got that fan taken care of.
Yeah.
So it was pretty cool. I thought it was cool.
Well, now I'm going to be listening for Stars and Stripes Forever.
I know. You'll never think of that song the same way again.
And if we're ever...
Especially if you're at the circus.
At the circus and we hear that, we're fucking leaving.
Well, here's the problem with that, because now Arin knows this song. If that song goes off, Erin's going to start a panic by grabbing all of the babies and running out of the tent.
We're gone! Bye!
So, I think we should probably wrap it up, because 2 hours, again, I have no chill, no regrets. Peace out. We have...
Socials.
We do not have X anymore. I deleted it because my husband is a federal employee, and I do not enjoy learning things via tweet. So if you have X, feel free to tell me what's going on X, but we are no longer on X. We do have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have TikTok, we have Blue Sky, we have Threads. We're all over the place. Our email is catastropheChroniclespod@gmail.com, and then our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. The website is where I do the show notes, which is a brief little description, links or, lists of all the different sources that I use. Mm-hmm. So if you want to dive deeper, start there. And if you find out something else that's cool, hit me up. Tell me what you learned. Mm-hmm. And we have a tip jar. So if you guys want to donate financially to the pod, that would be amazing. That is linked in the show notes and kind of all over the place. Don't feel obligated, but that's there if you want to help pay for books.
And rate and review.
And then, yes, please rate and review and get in contact with us. I had a number of you messaging me while we were in Florida, which was pretty darn cool. I had a lot of fun talking with you. So feel free, shoot us a message anytime. It might take us some time to answer because 4 kids.
Yep.
But I like getting them and I answer them as soon as I can. So yeah, with that.
Stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.